Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be talking about something that I know a lot of you are probably interested in, especially if you're a pilot or spend any time in the air,
Absolutely.
and that's staying hydrated.
Hmm.
So we've got this text all about fluid intake, and it really gets into some of the nitty-gritty science of it.
Right.
And one of the most interesting things that I've come across in this is that dehydration can be a real problem, even when you think you're in pretty comfortable conditions.
Yeah. It's easy to think of dehydration as something that's just a problem, out in the desert or,
Yeah.
if you're out on a really hot day doing some sort of exercise or something.
Yeah.
But the reality is you can get dehydrated pretty easily, even in a relatively comfortable cockpit or on the flight line.
Yeah, especially when you consider all the other factors that contribute to dehydration, specifically in aviation.
Right.
So, I mean, what are we talking about here? What are some of the things that pilots and other aviation folks need to be aware of?
Well, obviously heat's a big one, right? Like a hot cockpit or a hot flight line.
Uh-huh.
That's going to contribute to dehydration. But there are other things too, like even just cold weather, believe it or not.
Oh, really?
Yeah, wind, low humidity, all of these things can contribute to fluid loss. And of course, altitude is a big one.
Okay, so how does altitude play into it?
Well, when you're at higher altitudes, the air pressure is lower, right?
Oh,
And that lower air pressure actually causes you to breathe more rapidly.
okay.
And every time you breathe out, you're exhaling water vapor.
Hmm.
So the higher you go, the more water you're losing through your breath.
Wow, so it's like this hidden dehydrator.
Exactly. It's not something you really think about, but it's definitely happening. And then on top of that, you've got, things like medications,
Right.
physical activity,
Uh-huh.
diuretic drinks like caffeine and alcohol.
Yeah, I was gonna say, those are always tempting, especially, that pre-flight coffee.
Right.
But I guess we need to be careful about how much of those we're consuming.
Yeah, all of these factors can really add up and make you more susceptible to dehydration.
So this text actually highlights the fact that a lot of even experienced pilots underestimate their hydration needs.
Yeah, and it's not just about how much you're drinking either. It's also about understanding how your body works and how dehydration can sneak up on you.
Right, because our bodies have that built-in thirst mechanism,
Right.
right? But I guess the problem is by the time you actually feel thirsty,
You're already dehydrated.
you're already on the path to dehydration.
Exactly. So it's kind of like a delayed warning system.
Well, why is that? Why is it that we don't feel thirsty until we're already dehydrated?
Well, think of it this way.
Yeah.
Like you take a sip of water and it kind of, your body kind of hits the snooze button on that thirst alarm.
Oh, I see.
It's like, okay, I got a little bit of fluid. I'm good for now.
Uh-huh.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're fully hydrated.
So it's like we're tricking our bodies into thinking that we're okay when we're actually not.
Right. And especially when you're in an environment like flying, where there are so many other factors that are contributing to dehydration, it's really easy to slip into a dehydrated state without even realizing it.
That's actually a little bit unsettling to think about.
Yeah, it is. And that's why it's so important to understand the stages of heat exhaustion,
Right.
because they can really sneak up on you.
So what is the first stage?
The first stage is heat stress.
Heat stress.
Yeah. And this is where you might start to experience some subtle changes in your physical and mental performance.
Okay. And so what kind of body temperature are we talking about here when we're in heat stress?
It can start to happen at a pretty low temperature, like even just between 99.5 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow. So even just a slight elevation.
Yeah, you might notice that you're a little bit less dexterous. Your coordination might be a little bit off. Your
Ah.
decision-making might be a little bit slower.
I didn't realize it could happen that early on.
Yeah, it's subtle, but those subtle changes can make a big difference when you're piloting an aircraft.
Right.
And if heat stress isn't addressed, it can progress to the next stage, which is heat exhaustion.
Oh boy. So what's going on when we hit heat exhaustion?
So with heat exhaustion, your body temperature is going to be a little bit higher, somewhere between 101 and 105 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay.
And you're going to start to feel more pronounced symptoms like fatigue, nausea, or even vomiting,
Uh-huh.
dizziness, cramps, rapid breathing, fainting can also occur.
Okay, so at this point it's pretty clear that something's wrong, right?
Right. But even then, people often dismiss these symptoms as just feeling a little bit under the weather.
Mm.
And that's where the danger lies. Because if heat exhaustion progresses untreated, it can lead to the most severe stage, which is heat stroke.
Heat stroke.
Sure.
I mean, that sounds very serious.
It is. It's a life-threatening condition.
So tell me what's going on with the body when we're in heat stroke.
So heat stroke occurs when your body temperature exceeds 105 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay.
And at this point, your body's natural cooling system essentially shuts down. It can't keep up anymore. And you start to experience symptoms like mental confusion, disorientation, bizarre behavior, and potentially even coma.
Okay, so definitely we want to avoid getting to that stage at all costs.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And one of the things that this text really highlights is just how much fluid we lose through sweat.
Uh-huh.
It's easy to underestimate just how much we're sweating, especially when we're physically active.
So give me some numbers here. How much are we talking about?
Well, depending on the intensity and duration of your activity, you could be losing anywhere from half a liter to 3 liters of fluid per hour.
Okay.
That's the equivalent of 1 to 6 pounds of body weight loss per hour.
That's a lot. I had no idea it was that significant.
Yeah, it's easy to forget about, when you're focused on getting ready for a flight or you're rushing to the airport.
Right.
But if you've been physically active before a flight, particularly in hot conditions, you could be starting your journey significantly dehydrated.
That's a really good point. And then once you get up in the air, you've got all those other factors we talked about earlier. The altitude, the cabin pressure, the low humidity.
It all adds up.
Yeah, so it's like a perfect storm for dehydration.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand how dehydration affects your cognitive functions and your motor control.
So how does it actually impact our ability to pilot an aircraft?
Well, when you're dehydrated, your performance, dexterity, and coordination all take a hit.
Okay.
And that's crucial when you think about the fine motor skills that are required to control an aircraft.
Right. I mean, even small impairments could make a big difference up there.
Exactly. And it's not just about physical coordination either.
Right. There's the mental side of things, too.
Absolutely. Dehydration also impairs your ability to make quick decisions,
Okay.
which is obviously crucial in a lot of flight situations.
Right.
It can also affect your attention span and your working memory.
So making it harder to process information and react to things.
Exactly.
And I'm guessing alertness is probably affected, too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Dehydration leads to decreased alertness, which can really impact your situational awareness.
Yeah. I mean, if you're not alert, you're going to miss things. You're going to be less likely to recognize potential hazards.
Exactly. It's like trying to drive through fog.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be extra vigilant. But dehydration makes it harder to stay focused and alert.
And then on top of all that, this text mentions that dehydration can also impair your visual capabilities,
Right.
making it harder to do things like scan for traffic or interpret instruments.
Exactly. And perhaps most concerning, it can actually diminish your caution and care,
Oh, wow.
which can lead to riskier decisions and a reduced focus on safety procedures.
So it's like our internal alarm system gets turned down.
Exactly.
And we're less aware of potential dangers and more likely to make mistakes.
Right. And that's why it's so important to remember that staying hydrated isn't just about feeling comfortable.
Right.
It's about ensuring that you can perform at your best and maintain safety in the air.
Well, that's a pretty compelling case for staying hydrated.
Yeah.
So now that we understand the risks, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some solutions. Because this text also has some really good tips on how to stay ahead of dehydration and make sure we're performing at our peak.
Right. And one of the first things it addresses is this common misconception about water temperature.
Okay.
You often hear that lukewarm water is absorbed faster than cold water,
Uh-huh.
but that's actually a myth.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So ditch the lukewarm water bottle.
Exactly. Cool water around 40 degrees Fahrenheit is actually absorbed more efficiently by your body.
Okay, so make sure your water bottle is nice and cold, especially when you're getting ready for a flight.
Exactly.
Another practical tip from the text is to use a dedicated water bottle to track your fluid intake.
Right.
Because it's so easy to underestimate how much water you're actually drinking throughout the day unless you're consciously measuring it.
Yeah. Having a designated water bottle not only helps you track your progress, but it also serves as a visual reminder to stay hydrated.
And speaking of reminders, I guess it's also important to be mindful of those things that we talked about earlier that can dehydrate you,
Right.
like caffeine and alcohol.
Yeah. Even though a cup of coffee before a flight might seem harmless, the diuretic effects of caffeine can actually contribute to fluid loss,
Okay.
and alcohol is even worse. Obviously, it's best to avoid alcohol altogether before and during flights.
Right, not only because of the dehydration, but also because it can impair your judgment
Exactly.
and reaction time.
Right.
What about exercise? We talked about how physical activity can lead to significant fluid loss through sweat.
Right.
So what are some recommendations for pilots who like to work out before a flight or do other physical activities?
Well, if you've had a strenuous workout before a flight, you need to be extra mindful of your fluid intake.
Okay.
Try to replace those lost fluids gradually throughout the day leading up to your flight.
So don't just chug a bunch of water right before you take off.
Exactly.
What about those long-haul flights across different time zones? Does that affect hydration?
Absolutely. If you're traveling to a location with a significantly different climate,
Mm-hmm.
the text recommends giving yourself 1 to 2 weeks to acclimatize. It takes time for your body to adjust to those changes in temperature and humidity.
Right.
And during that adjustment period, you're more susceptible to dehydration.
That's a good reminder because it's easy to forget about those subtle environmental changes.
Right. And it's also important to think about personal factors like your age,
Okay.
any recent illnesses, or any medications you might be taking.
Right. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach to hydration.
Exactly. You need to be aware of your own individual needs and adjust your fluid intake accordingly.
And perhaps the most important takeaway from this text is this: listen to your body.
Absolutely.
If you're feeling lightheaded or dizzy, those are warning signs that you shouldn't ignore.
Right.
It's your body's way of telling you that something's off.
Exactly. Don't try to push through it. Take a break, grab some water, and give yourself time to rehydrate.
Because your safety and the safety of those around you is paramount.
Absolutely.
Well, it seems like there's a lot more to hydration than just, grabbing a glass of water when you're thirsty. There's a real science to it, especially when it comes to flying.
Mm.
But before we dive deeper into some more specific hydration strategies,
Okay.
let's take a quick pause. We'll be back in a moment to explore more practical tips and insights to help you stay hydrated and perform at your best in the air.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we're back and ready to get into some more nitty-gritty practical stuff about staying hydrated when you're flying.
Okay.
Now, one thing that I found really interesting in this text was the discussion about electrolytes.
Ah.
You always hear about how important electrolytes are when you're exercising,
Right.
but this text actually points out that for most people who are just doing moderate exercise,
Mm-hmm.
they're probably getting enough electrolytes from their diet.
Exactly. A typical American diet already has plenty of electrolytes in it.
Okay, so when you say moderate exercise, what are we talking about here?
So we're talking about things like brisk walking, cycling, swimming,
Okay.
activities where you can still hold a conversation.
Right.
And for most pilots, their pre-flight routines and activities
Mm.
are probably going to fall within this moderate range.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So unless you're, training for a marathon or doing some sort of extreme physical exertion,
Right.
you probably don't need to worry about electrolyte supplements.
In fact, it sounds like you could actually be doing more harm than good if you're overdoing it on the electrolytes.
Exactly. Your body needs a balance.
Okay, so for those of us who are, just sticking to moderate exercise, what are some practical tips for making sure we're staying hydrated?
Well, one of the biggest things is to make hydration a habit.
Okay.
Don't wait until you're thirsty to drink water.
Right.
Carry a water bottle with you throughout the day and just sip on it regularly.
That's good advice. I mean, it's so easy to get caught up in whatever you're doing
Right.
and, not realize that you haven't had anything to drink in a while.
Exactly. And having that visual reminder,
Yeah.
having that water bottle right there with you,
Yeah.
it can really make a difference.
And you know what else I've heard people say is set reminders on your phone
Oh, yeah.
or your smartwatch.
That's a great idea.
Just to kind of prompt you to drink some water.
Especially if you're somebody who just tends to forget.
Totally.
Those reminders can be really helpful.
What about those of us who, find plain water a little bit boring?
Well, you can always add some natural flavor to it.
Yeah.
Slices of lemon, cucumber, fresh berries,
Mm-hmm.
things like that can make it a little bit more appealing.
Yeah, I like to put a sprig of mint in my water.
Oh, yeah, that's nice and refreshing.
Yeah.
And there are also, sugar-free electrolyte powders or tablets that you can add to your water
Right.
if you want a little bit of a flavor boost or if you've been sweating a lot
Mm-hmm.
and you feel like you need an extra electrolyte boost.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah,
So it's really all about finding what works for you and making it a habit.
exactly.
Yeah.
You got to make it sustainable.
This text also talks about pre-hydrating,
Yes,
especially before flights.
very important.
So how much should we be drinking before we get on a plane?
Well, the text recommends aiming for 16 to 20 ounces of water
Okay.
in the 2 to 3 hours leading up to your flight.
Okay, so like fuel up your body before you fuel up the plane.
Exactly.
Now, what about during the flight itself?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how do we stay hydrated when we're up in the air?
Well, first of all, make sure you pack an empty water bottle.
Okay.
that you can fill up once you're through security.
Right. I mean, I've definitely been guilty of forgetting to bring an empty bottle before,
Yeah, it's easy to do.
especially with all the other things you have to remember when you're traveling.
Right.
But luckily, a lot of airports have those water bottle filling stations now, which is super convenient.
Definitely. And once you're on board the plane,
Yeah,
don't hesitate to ask the flight attendants for water.
right.
That's their job.
Totally. I mean, I know those little cups they give you might seem small,
Yeah,
but it all adds up,
it does.
especially on a long flight. Another thing that the text mentions is avoiding salty snacks and sugary drinks on the plane, because those can actually dehydrate you further.
Exactly. Those pretzels and those sodas might seem tempting,
Yeah,
but they're not doing you any favors when it comes to hydration.
so stick to the water.
Water is your best friend when you're flying.
So we talked earlier about how, there are personal factors that can affect hydration needs,
Right.
like age or medications. So are there any specific recommendations for pilots who might be more susceptible to dehydration?
Well, one thing that the text mentions is that older adults tend to have a decreased sense of thirst.
Oh, okay.
So they might not feel thirsty even when their bodies are actually in need of fluids.
So they might need to be even more proactive about drinking water.
Exactly.
Mm.
And the same goes for pilots who are taking certain medications,
Right.
like diuretics, for example. Those can increase fluid loss.
So if you're on any kind of medication, it's always a good idea to talk to your doctor about how it might affect your hydration needs.
Right.
Okay, now for the question that I'm sure is on everyone's mind.
Oh, boy.
What about coffee?
Ah, yes, the pre-flight coffee ritual.
I mean, so many pilots rely on that cup of coffee to get them going in the morning.
It's true.
But we also know that caffeine is a diuretic.
It is.
So is it okay to have coffee before a flight?
Well, one cup of coffee is probably not going to have a significant impact on your hydration levels,
Okay.
especially if you're drinking plenty of water throughout the day.
So it's all about moderation
Exactly.
and balance.
Right.
If you're a regular coffee drinker, you don't necessarily need to give it up completely. Just be mindful of your overall fluid intake.
Right. And maybe avoid that triple shot espresso right before takeoff.
Probably a good idea. I
Yeah.
think the goal here is to start your flight feeling alert and hydrated,
Right.
not jittery and dehydrated.
Exactly.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here today.
You have.
We've talked about the science of hydration. We've talked about some practical tips for staying hydrated before, during, and after flights.
Right.
So what would you say is the key takeaway for our listeners?
I would say the key takeaway is that hydration is not just about comfort. It's a critical component of pilot performance and safety.
Right.
By understanding the risks of dehydration and implementing effective hydration strategies,
Right.
you can ensure that you're performing at your best and mitigating potential hazards in the air.
I like that. Make it a priority, just like you would anything else that's important for your safety.
Exactly.
So before we wrap things up, I'd love to get your personal take on this.
Okay.
What are some of your own personal strategies for staying hydrated, especially when you're flying or in other challenging conditions?
Yeah. I mean, for me personally, I've started making a point of drinking a full glass of water before each meal.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah, it's just like a simple thing, but it kind of helps to get you ahead of the game.
Right.
And I always keep a reusable water bottle with me.
Yeah, so it's like, if I see it, I'm more likely to take a sip.
Right. It's all about those visual cues.
Yeah.
I like to use a marked water bottle,
Oh, yeah.
so I can see how much I'm drinking.
Yeah.
And I try to set goals for myself, okay, I need to finish this much by this time,
Yeah.
and then this much by this time.
Right.
It just helps me to stay on track.
Yeah. I mean, it's so easy to let those things slip,
It is.
especially when you're busy.
Right.
And, thinking back to our discussion about the stages of heat exhaustion, it's kind of scary how easy it is to dismiss those early warning signs.
Yeah. I mean, we might just attribute, fatigue or a slight headache
Right.
to stress or a busy schedule.
Yeah.
When in reality, it could be our bodies telling us that we're dehydrated.
Exactly. So it's like we really got to pay attention to those subtle cues and not just brush them off.
Right.
So in your opinion, what's the most important thing that pilots can do to, kind of mitigate those risks associated with dehydration?
I think the biggest thing is to make hydration a proactive habit,
Okay.
not a reactive response.
So don't wait until you're already feeling thirsty
Exactly.
or, experiencing those symptoms of heat exhaustion.
Right. You got to stay ahead of the game.
Yeah.
Make it part of your routine. just like you would with pre-flight checks or flight planning.
Oh, I like that analogy. It's
Yeah.
like you wouldn't take off without checking your fuel levels.
Right.
You shouldn't take off without making sure that your body is properly hydrated.
Exactly.
And it's not just about the quantity of fluids, it's also about the timing.
Right. Prehydrating before flight is crucial,
Yeah,
and then continuing to sip on water throughout the flight.
especially on those long hauls.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a continuous process.
Not a one-time fix.
Right.
And, it's not just about avoiding negative consequences either.
Mhm.
It's also about, maximizing your performance,
Right.
feeling your best.
Absolutely. When you're properly hydrated, you're more alert. You're more focused.
Right.
You're better able to make decisions.
Yeah, it's like you're setting yourself up for success.
Exactly.
Well, I think we've covered just about everything there is to know about hydration for aviators.
I think so.
Any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
Just remember, knowledge is power. By understanding the science behind hydration and implementing these practical strategies,
Right.
you can really take control of your well-being and make sure that you're flying at your peak.
Well said. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise on this important topic.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to take what you've learned today and make hydration a priority in your aviation journey.
Absolutely.
Stay hydrated, fly safe, and until next time, happy landings.